Kristen Eide-Tollefson. I'm the owner of the Bookhouse. I have 2 young partners, and the date today is December 6th, 2018.
Let's start with the very basics.
I think you're supposed to tell who you are, too.
I am?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Rob Hahn, and I'm the producer of this oral history. I think that's good enough, right?
Good.
Let's start with the basics. What brought you to Dinkytown, and when did you start the business?
Really, the bookstores brought me to Dinkytown. And I was at the university in 1972, but I married a bookseller who was very involved in academic books, selling them to libraries. And in this very space where we are now, there was a collective of dealers called Dinkytown Antiquarian. And I came to Dinkytown to visit the bookstores here.
What was, how would you describe the vibe, particularly among the bookstore owners at that time?
Well, Dinkytown had an extremely collective vibe. Everyone was on the streets, talking to each other, lots of small businesses, there'd been a sort of a transition into the kinds of businesses that you would expect interest in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
So there were Maya Market and Tom the Tailor and all these classic characters from Dinkytown in that era. And at that time, there was one of the dealers who was in the group, Rob Hahn, who's a professor at the university, and he experienced the same thing we did. Was that Reagan came into office and immediately cut off the funding of the libraries, and so we had no outlet for all these academic books. And so Rob called my former husband and mentor, Jim Cummings, and said, "Hey, you want to go into Dinkytown? There's a new spot." And so in 2 weeks, we set up both of our stocks using old bookcases and the bookcases from the Dinkytown Dime and other infrastructure from the old, I'm sorry, I'm blanking, Perrine's bookstore, which
Okay.
had recently gone out of business. So there was a real turnover going on in Dinkytown.
And what year was this?
1976.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the characters in the book business, Melvin McClosh. What are your memories of him?
Melvin McClosh. Melvin was the quintessential. I mean, he was legendary as a bookseller and as a character. He first opened in Dinkytown in the late 50s. He lived on a house on the corner of 5th and 14th, and there were books in the house. That was his first bookstore, and then there was a rooming house upstairs, and some of Dinkytown's greatest characters from that period lived up there. Diamond Dave Whitaker lived up there. Joe Pack, all sorts of people lived up there, and then he opened a regular store on the back of Bridgman's, which is at 4th and 14th. I don't know the exact date, maybe 58. And that was a major gathering place for people to talk and have conversations about radical politics, culture, everything that was going on at the time. And the story was that Dylan often slept on the floor and listened to all of this. McClosh was a sardonic, brilliant character, and he was famous for putting signs in his windows such as homecomers go home, or he would ask people if they wanted him to sign their book that they bought from him, and he would sign it God. He was just a very sardonic, fascinating old Scotsman.
I had read that he was a bit of a curmudgeon. I mean,
Yes,
and that kind of fits what you're describing.
Yes,
Is
yes.
that accurate?
And he was more interested in the integrity of intellectual work than he was in making a sale. So people would come up to him with a book, and he would go, "Oh, you don't want that book. You want this." And he'd try to sell them something that was leagues above their level of understanding. So he was, and he endured. I mean, he was forced out by Bridgman's, and the famous sit-in. There was a famous sit-in in which a very large number of people participated when he was forced out, and they protested in Bridgman's and just went line after line and sat in Bridgman's to protest his leaving. But since he hadn't been paying rent, that didn't actually finally work, and he left and went down to he actually, I think he went from there to the West Bank, which was a fascinating store. He was in the old firehouse there, and then he went down to Dundas and finally out to Minnetonka. Yeah.
Another character, and I want to know your memories of him, the Walker, Phil Holland.
Phil was everywhere. I mean, he was a walker. He walked the streets, he walked the campus, and you probably have already heard that he was he had a prodigious memory, if not. Yeah. What's the word when someone is a genius? What is that word that starts with a P? You know, they're a genius in just one particular area.
Oh.
Yeah. Anyway, he.
Okay, let's start over on that one.
Okay.
Just because.
Yeah.
What are your memories of the Walker, Phil Holland?
Well, he was always well dressed, and he was in constant motion, walking up and down the streets of Dinkytown, the campus. He had a phenomenal memory for statistics, and baseball was one of his favorite topics. And he could recite the statistics for baseball back at decades.
Sorry.
He also
It's still catching, or you're catching it. Can we move it a little further this way?
Yeah.
So I can see it.
I think my most personal.
Let's hold on just a
Sure.
sec. Okay.
The most personal.
Yeah. Let's if you don't mind, let's start over
No,
again.
not at all.
And if you could start, I'll give you the question, but if you could start using his name,
Okay.
I think that would help. So.
Good.
What are your memories of Phil Holland, the Walker?
Oh, Phil Holland. Yes, he was he walked everywhere. He was always well dressed and very upright in his posture, and he walked the streets, the campus, all over Dinkytown. I don't know where else he went, but he had a prodigious memory for statistics. And my most personal memory is that when we first came to Dinkytown, my former husband Jim Cummings and I, to open the Bookhouse in Dinkytown, he ran into Jim and he said, University of Minnesota, it gave him the dates that he had been at the university. And Jim had never spoken to him, but he remembered Jim, and he remembered when he had been there. And that's the kind of memory he had. So he also, I believe, would make telephone calls that there was no one on the other end. I believe that was one of his peccadillos. But he was a fascinating man, and he was brilliant. I mean, in this one specific way. And he was in Dinkytown for decades. Many of us knew Phil.
Is it true, to your recollection, that he would give advice on myriad topics, even if people didn't want that advice, be it the stock market or politics?
Yes, anything that had to do with statistics. I never was accosted by him on political matters, but he was very involved. Yes, doesn't surprise me.
What other characters stand out in your memory?
Well, you know, well, of course, Bruce, who recently died. He was the character who lived under the bridge, had an encampment under the bridge for many years. Has anybody talked to you about him?
No.
And we had a nickname for him, which I can't remember at the moment. He and his partner used to sell. She would sell things on the street, mostly jewelry, I think. And he would just sit there. He always wore a top hat, and they got around on bicycles. And I remember one day we decided, for Preserve Historic Dinkytown, we decided to take a picture of him and asked his permission. And then said, "So, Bruce, when did you first come to Dinkytown?" And he said, "I came for the protests in '72, and I never left." And so he had a very eccentric dignity. Wasn't very talkative, but was a major presence. An aesthetic, an artistic presence. He was always garbed, as was his partner, and they both have recently died.
Stop it real quickly.
Okay, we are rolling again.
Okay. Any other characters before we move on to another topic?
Well, I want to mention quickly the importance of the characters in Dinkytown. I guess you wouldn't call him a character, but a figure, Marv Davidoff, who was one of the most important activists in the history of Minnesota. And he lived in Florence Court. And he was in Dinkytown a great deal. And he would sit on the street and talk to people about community and talk to people about issues. And the characters in Dinkytown have served a number of functions. One of them has been to just communicate the history of Dinkytown and their history to students, to the incoming students and incoming students and incoming students. But also they kept a certain vigil on the streets. There was always someone on the street who knew what was going on, who knew who people were in trouble, and there was a network on the streets that people could count on for support and for help. It was like a village. It was both a nuisance and a real treasure, the characters in Dinkytown.
So we're what, if my math is right, about 42 years, I think, removed from when you first set up shop here.
Right.
How has it changed from the mid-'70s to 2018 in terms of the characters, the vibe, the student involvement?
Well, I would say that a lot of the characters who have, and alumni and figures from the 60s and 70s, who created a lot of cultural fabric and the story fabric in Dinkytown, have moved on. And so there is less, there's less of the old guard on the street, and I think that it's a very thoughtful question. It really is important to me, but I guess it's a younger vibe. The vibe is younger. It's always been, the energy here has always been student energy, but there's been we're missing some of that grounding of some of the old businesses that are gone and some of the old characters that are gone.
Which is a perfect segue to talk about the organization Preserve Historic Dinkytown. Tell me, in general terms, how that came about and what your role was in it.
Well, in 2012, we had a very busy 5 years between 2011 and 2015. In 2012, it was the Marshall U High, the old Marshall U High that became the UTech Center, and was a huge center of activity, came down. And in 2013, after the Bookhouse moved because the venue was built, we had a grand reopening. And I'm sorry, I should have mentioned. So in 2012, when the venue proposed to build where we are and take out the podium, the Bookhouse, and the House of Hanson, Matt, who's one of the manager owners here, and the manager at the coffee house, created a campaign called Save Dinkytown, along with some other students and people who worked in Dinkytown. And that campaign almost won. That campaign almost won. But it didn't. The venue was built. Bookhouse had to move, 80,000 books, and we had our grand opening in 2013 here, and advertised that we were going to have a Dinkytown History Night. We didn't know what to expect, and Eric Storley, who's now on the Preserve Dinkytown board, turned up a dozen of the oldest of the old guard, people I had never even met. And this is old musicians, and people who had lived in McCosh's rooming house, who had been the music makers in Dinkytown. And a dozen of them came and told stories all night. We do have a recording of that. But Bill Savrin was one of the people who came. He had a bookstore on the West Bank, and he started Savrin Rusoff here with Marley Rusoff. Said to me, I have some negatives of the Scholar that I've never developed. I'm 73 years old. What am I going to do with them? And I said, well, it sounds to me like you'd better develop them. So he did, and we'll have a little opening here with a little gallery, and you can show them. And so he said, well, and maybe Spider John will come and play. And I went, Spider John Kerner? And he said, yeah. I said, fine, okay. And not long after that, I got a telephone call from Spokane, Washington. And a man named Bob Zeller was calling. and he said, I hear Spider John is coming to play at the Bookhouse, and Bill Savern is going to show his pictures of the scholar. I said, yes. He said, I'm sending media in. I said, who are you? And he used to be here in Minneapolis, and he has been collecting cultural history, counterculture history, for decades. And he felt that this was an extremely important event in the context of counterculture history, and proceeded to co-found with me, whom he assigned the Minnesota role, co-found Preserve Historic Dinkytown. And the purpose was to, and I took it from to preserve Dinkytown's history and character for the future, and the memories for the future, so that they can continue to be made by all the students who continue to come. And Bob convinced us that, Bob's premise was that Dinkytown was an extremely important link in the whole counterculture movement, and that it in fact influenced the counterculture movement, which to our mind at that time was quite an exaggeration. But as interviews have unfolded and our research has demonstrated, he's absolutely right. And that's really, I think, why you're here. And so I have been the organizer, the main organizer. Our main event was to put together a Dinkytown reunion in time to influence the course of development in Dinkytown, which at that time was being pressured. We were being pressured for a new. I'm sorry, I'm just not doing well. This is really complicated.
It's okay.
I wrote it all down, but I
It's
can't
okay.
be reading it.
So we can just pick it up.
Okay.
About
Can I ask you to move to the center of the chair a little bit more? There you
I'm
go.
just not sure how much detail to provide. It gets
No, we're good.
really
I'll
complicated.
interject a
Okay.
question or something.
A little bit more possible?
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Okay, great.
So let's pick it up with a question. What was the feeling with regard to both development and the establishment of Preserve Historic Dinkytown?
Well, there was a lot of tension involved, because while a number of us were very interested in the Durand development for the hotel, it was going to take down a half a block of Dinkytown. Dinkytown is only 4 square blocks. And there was not a lot of give and take with the community about the design or the details. And so there was a lot of tension within the business community. The business community was for development, and at the same time there were a number of people who did not want to see Dinkytown taken down building by building, as has happened in Stadium Village. So what Preserve Historic Dinkytown did is to start collecting information about the counterculture history of Dinkytown, because we wanted to weigh in on the significance, the historic significance, the technical historic significance of Dinkytown for the purposes of a potential designation of Dinkytown as an historic district. It had been studied by the city as a potential historic district. It was a recommendation of the recent small area plan that was in progress at that time too, that Dinkytown be examined as a potential small business district, historic business district. And so Preserve Historic Dinkytown took that on as a campaign, but also as to develop and bring together the community of the larger community of people who love Dinkytown. And that really, I've been inspired to do this work because of the number of years I've been at the Bookhouse and listened to people tell their stories about Dinkytown, listen to them tell about what a difference Dinkytown made in their lives. And so we began writing, we began researching. Sean started taking films and videos of the interviews and of the history, and eventually the work that we did became a document known as Dinkytown: A Living History, and it was actually appended to the city's own study for the historic designation. There's lots more controversy involved.
Yeah. What, in terms of the historic designation, What role did the organization, and maybe you specifically, have to play when it came to city politics?
We worked very closely with Cordelia Pearson from Marcy Holmes. She was the president at that time. And the Dinkytown reunion of 2014, November 2014, was intended as a kickoff to spark a resurgence of interest and an understanding of the importance of Dinkytown to the city. And Jacob Fry was invited, and he came, and he spoke. He was probably, he was a very challenging, he was our, of course, now mayor, was our council member at that time, and he was very much in favor of development, very much in favor of density, and very skeptical about the designation of Dinkytown. He told us later that that without Preserve Historic Dinkytown, there would not have been a designation. However, he's the one who created the compromise that allowed all of Dinkytown to support it. Barbara Cam and I and Cordelia were probably the key lobbyists for the development of the material and for the designation. And Hyla Mays wrote the study. So and Ossian did a video for us for the city council. So it's an all-court effort. We probably gave two weeks of an announcement for the Dinkytown reunion. We had over 50 people come. So.
What was your reaction?
Could I stop a
Yep.
second? Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
What was your reaction, personally and professionally, when you got the historic designation?
Oh, well, tremendous relief. I mean, this had been at least a half-time job since 2012, trying to keep Dinkytown together during this transition. And it's just very satisfying to share that accomplishment and to have built, despite the conflicts and the tensions, to have built a community out of the divisions about Dinkytown between the neighborhood and the Preserve Historic Dinkytown people and the DBA. It was very gratifying to finally come together on it. And I think we have a ways to go in terms of being able to really utilize the history of Dinkytown as part of the marketing of Dinkytown. But we're on that path.
Now I want to circle back in no particular order to things that we haven't covered but that popped into my mind.
Yeah.
You mentioned Marshall University High School, and I think it closed in '82, so it was still in existence for about 6 years after you opened.
Oh, yes.
So what did that contribute, in your opinion, to the neighborhood?
Well, besides, I mean, some of the most notable Dinkytown characters came out of Marshall U High. They'd had their 50th reunion while we were, I think, was it 2 years ago? And we had a little reception for some of them. And they were a handful. They were a really interesting, bright group of kids who were not conventional in their behavior or in their thinking. And of course, they loved the Bookhouse. But there was just always commotion. And they would stream into Dinkytown, for lunch and stream back through when they were not supposed to be streaming back through. And they brought a lot of vitality to Dinkytown.
You mentioned Spider John Kerner. When you think of him, what comes to mind?
Well, I don't. An era that I missed is what comes to my mind. And real respect and gratitude for the role he played in the music of that time, which I just am learning. I continue to learn about. And he's, one of the things that I want to say is that the whole fabric and motive around Preserve Historic Dinkytown came out of and has been continued to be bound together by old friendships, enduring friendships that were made in Dinkytown. And that's why there is a Preserve Historic Dinkytown, because of these friendships, because of Bob Zeller's friendship with Dave Feehan, because of Barbara's friendship with Laurie Savrin, because of Ossian's friendship and connections. When we formed Preserve Historic Dinkytown, Bob sent us a list, which I have, of extremely notable. Our founding board were very notable characters. Professor David Noble from the university, who was so involved in the 70s issues, and Red Nelson was on our advisory board. He was the owner of the 10 O'Clock Scholar. So he sent us just a list of all these people who have gone on to become famous and important, who still consider Dinkytown their home. And this network of friendships is still what feeds and sustains Dinkytown and Preserve Historic Dinkytown.
Touching once again on the encroachment of development.
Yeah.
What was your reaction and the reaction of others when House of Hanson decided to close?
Well, it was understandable that House of Hanson didn't want to try to compete with the promise of a brand new grocery store going into the Marshall across the street from her. The property was very valuable. It was, those businesses and that corner were a real, that we were institutions in the community, and that corner was a very important part of Dinkytown. And so it was heartbreaking, you know, for us to have to close the Bookhouse and for the podium to leave, and for the House of Hanson, which had been there for over 80 years, to be gone. It's certainly an understandable that the Hansons, that Laurel wanted to sell. But we fought it as hard and long as we could.
Another institution that recently closed was Vecchio's. What are your memories of Vecchio's, and what did it mean to the neighborhood?
I think Vecchio's was one of the central meeting grounds of alumni from, 50 years and more. Actually, former Vice President Mondale was a regular visitor there, and that's in fact how we came to think of him as a potential champion for Preserve Historic Dinkytown for the designation. And he and his group are just one of the many clusters of old friends and colleagues who continued to meet at Vecchio's. The menu never changed, and it was a family institution into 3 generations, 2 or 3 generations. So that's really the kind of business that Dinkytown sustained and was sustained by. And I have been mentioning recently to Dave Feehan, as he puts together this roadmap for Dinkytown, that we still have a number of businesses that are multi-generational businesses, that are very old businesses. The impression is, everything's turned over and Dinkytown, is losing all its businesses. That's not true. And this business is being passed on, and there are a number of businesses that are still lifetime investments for their proprietors.
How important was former Vice President Mondale's role in helping get the historic preservation designation?
It was very important. He came in at the end. We asked him to make a statement at the end, and he was extremely, extremely supportive. And the timing was absolutely perfect. We needed somebody who was high profile with lots of credibility, and with lots of integrity. And he wrote an editorial which coincidentally appeared the day before the vote, and was very influential. Also, Tom Weber, although he assured me that there was no relationship between the timing of the vote and his interview, the tour he took of Dinkytown, that came out, and the Mondale editorial came out the week that the city council decision was made. And so though it had seemed like a really long slog for us through those years and through all those efforts to have that to have NPR and Vice President Mondale so visible in their support for Dinkytown at the very I mean, NPR can't be said, the interviews that NPR held were very supportive. It was very influential timing, and kind of felt like the cavalry coming over the hill. Yeah.
What am I forgetting to ask that may be obvious or not so obvious that you want to add about the history and your time here?
Well, I think the fact that this interview and that this project that you have is a carrying forward of the story that we started to try to tell, and a story that really needs to be told now, and needs to be told now, is Pat Coleman at the Historical Society challenged us to do, is really one of the more meaningful pieces to me, that this is continuing, that the story is continuing. Well, I really should acknowledge all the different contributions to Preserve Historic Dinkytown. And one of those was the Loring Bar and Cafe, now called. And it was really our gathering place. It was what gave our events a certain panache. We would have these lunches and talk, and that's the first time we met Ossian, as he came and videoed our conversations. They, of course, were part of the hosts of the big event, our reunion at the Varsity, and we still meet there. We meet there now again. And coming up, we have our annual holiday gathering in the Pasta Bar, up in this room right here, which is the mezzanine, the west mezzanine, right in the location where Dylan's room was, in the old Gray's drugstore. So, and of course, the Bookhouse in Dinkytown played a very important role in communications and coordination, and now is the home of the archive. And we have hosted a number of returning Dinkytowners. Probably the most famous, Diamond Dave Whitaker, who came from San Francisco. As the word got out through Zeller and through others that we were reliving, that we were reviewing Dinkytown's history, it became a gathering point and for people to come back and to be interviewed and to be part of that history. Diamond Dave Whitaker claims that he is the one who gave Dylan the copy of Bound for Glory, and in fact that sent him off on his trip to Greenwich Village. He went directly from Dinkytown to Greenwich Village to see Woody Guthrie. And Diamond Dave came back and gave us quite a show. He did interviews, he did a tour, he took us to his old house where he lived with his girlfriend, and Dylan stayed, and told us stories upon stories, and encountered some of the old characters in Dinkytown. He and Al Milgram had quite an exchange when he was here, and then he connected with the more recent poets. He was hosted by Jim Lindfesty, which was very gracious, and we had a lunch for him, and people came back and visited him, and that's the kind of event that Preserve Historic Dinkytown has had. We're really a loose amalgam of projects, and it's always exciting to see what people want to do next.
How about the Karl Latovsky walks tour?
Yes, in Preserve Historic Dinkytown commissioned Karl Latovsky, who is a local historian, to do a Dinkytown tour, to put together the information around a Dinkytown tour, and she did the first one back in, I think, 2015, and then went on to get a grant with the Dinkytown Business Association to do a more extensive tour, and that is now online, and that is now in a pamphlet. So that's one of the enduring, visible accomplishments of our collaborations here in Dinkytown on the history, that it's now available in an app on people's phones. One of the most interesting things about being an elder in Dinkytown is how many different eras of reporters come from the Daily to investigate. They always have a fresh perspective and ask questions about Dinkytown and Dinkytown's history. And JD, or Jay Dugan, from the Daily, worked very hard to get a spot for his take on the developments in Dinkytown. He's very interested in the roadmap that's being created about for the future of Dinkytown. That's a collaboration of Marcy Homes and Preserve Historic Dinkytown and the Dinkytown Business Association. He had some very interesting observations about the students, and this is something that one of the purposes of the roadmap is to bring the community of students and the community of businesses closer together. And it's always been one of the goals of Preserve Historic Dinkytown, the continued vitality of the business district, and the continued support of Dinkytown as a place for students.